Picture this. You are standing on a ridge of bare rock somewhere in the heart of the Sahara. In every direction there is nothing but heat, silence, and sand that stretches so far it seems to touch the sky. There is no river in sight, no lake, no green line on the horizon that might hint at water. And yet, beneath your feet, in the exact spot where you are standing, there is a hidden tunnel running for miles through the earth, carrying fresh water from an ancient underground sea straight into fields of wheat, grapes, and dates. You cannot see it. You cannot hear it. But it is there, and it has been there for more than 2,000 years. Now ask yourself a question. Who would have the knowledge, the patience, and the sheer stubborn will to dig hundreds of kilometers of tunnels under one of the most brutal deserts on Earth, using nothing but hand tools, in order to build a civilization where, by every reasonable expectation, no civilization should exist? The answer is a people that most of the world has never heard of. Not the Egyptians, not the Romans, not the Phoenicians. A desert kingdom called the Garamantes, who ruled the deep Sahara for roughly 1,000 years, who built cities, palaces, and tombs in the middle of nowhere, who fought wars against Rome, who traded in gold, salt, and human lives, and who eventually vanished so completely that for centuries afterward, historians assumed they had simply been a myth invented by Greek storytellers. They were not a myth, but for a very long time, almost everyone believed they were nothing more than wandering desert raiders, primitive nomads mentioned briefly by a few ancient writers, and then forgotten. That assumption turned out to be one of the biggest misreadings in the history of archaeology. And the story of how that misreading was corrected, piece by piece, tunnel by tunnel, bone by bone, is one of the strangest detective stories the desert has ever produced. So let's go back to the beginning. Not to the moment the world discovered the truth about the Garamantes, but to the moment their story actually started, thousands of years before anyone wrote a single word about them. Long before the Garamantes existed, the Sahara was not the Sahara we know today. Around 10,000 years ago, and continuing for several thousand years after that, North Africa experienced what scientists now call the African Humid Period, sometimes nicknamed the Green Sahara. During this time, monsoon rains reached much farther north than they do now, and the region that is today an ocean of sand was covered with lakes, rivers, grasslands, and forests. Elephants, hippos, giraffes, and crocodiles lived where there is now nothing but dunes. Human communities lived along the shores of shallow lakes, herding cattle and fishing, leaving behind rock art that still exists today, painted and carved onto stone in places that no longer have a drop of water anywhere nearby. But nothing green lasts forever in that part of the world. Around 5,000 years ago, the rains retreated south, the lakes dried up, and the Sahara began its long transformation into the hyperarid desert it remains today. Most of the human groups who had depended on that vanished water either moved south with the rain or adapted to a much harsher, thinner way of life on the desert's edges. Here is where the story gets interesting, and here is where the first real curiosity gap opens up. Because while the surface water disappeared, not all of it actually left. A portion of that ancient rainfall did not evaporate. It sank downward through sand and rock, into deep underground layers of stone that could hold it, layers called aquifers. Locked away beneath the desert floor, sealed off from the sun, that water simply stayed there, unused and untouched, for thousands of years. Scientists call it fossil water, because, much like a fossil, it is a frozen record of a past that no longer exists on the surface. And according to researchers who have studied the region, the aquifer beneath the area where the Garamantes would later settle may be one of the largest underground reservoirs of water anywhere on the planet. So somewhere beneath one of the driest, most lethal landscapes on Earth, there was an enormous hidden ocean, waiting. The question was never whether that water existed. The question was whether anyone would ever be clever enough and desperate enough to find a way to reach it. That is where the Garamantes enter the story. Archaeological evidence suggests that ancestors of this population were already present as tribal groups in the region known as the Fazan, in what is now southwestern Libya, by around 1000 BCE. But it was not until several centuries later that they truly begin to appear as a distinct, organized civilization, one capable of building cities and shaping the landscape around them. And notice that phrase, shaping the landscape, because it matters. Most peoples who live in deserts learn to survive by adapting to the land exactly as it is. The Garamantes did something different. They looked at a landscape that offered them almost nothing on the surface, and instead of retreating from it, they decided to go underground and take what they needed by force of engineering. But before we get to the tunnels, and we will get to the tunnels, because that is really the heart of this entire story, we need to talk about how the outside world first heard of these people at all. And that story begins not with an archaeologist, but with a Greek historian who never actually visited the deep Sahara himself, and who left behind an account so strange, so vivid, and so controversial that historians are still arguing about parts of it today. His name was Herodotus, and what he wrote about the Garamantes would shape their reputation for the next 2,500 years. But here's the twist. What Herodotus described was not a peaceful desert kingdom of farmers and engineers. He described something far more dramatic and far more troubling, and that account is where our story really begins to turn. Around the 5th century BCE, Herodotus wrote what is now the earliest known surviving account of the Garamantes. He described them as a very great nation, people who herded cattle and farmed dates in the depths of Libya, which in his time was the Greek word for essentially all of Africa, west of the Nile. On its own, that description sounds fairly ordinary. A farming and herding people, living far from the Mediterranean coast, doing what desert dwellers do. But then Herodotus added something else, something that has echoed through history ever since. He wrote that the Garamantes hunted a group of people he called the troglodyte Ethiopians, using 4-horse chariots, and that these troglodytes were the fastest runners of any people known to the Greeks at that time. Later Roman writers repeated and expanded on this claim, describing the hunted people as cave dwellers who lived on reptiles and spoke a language that supposedly sounded more like the screeching of bats than actual human speech. A description dripping with the casual prejudice so common in ancient ethnography. Now stop and think about what that image actually implies. Chariots in the middle of the Sahara. Human beings on foot being chased down for capture. For centuries, later historians read this passage and concluded that the Garamantes were, at least in part, slave raiders, using their famous 4-horse chariots to hunt other African peoples in the desert and sell them onward. And here is where I want to pause the story for a moment, because this is exactly the kind of moment where you have to ask yourself, how much of this can we actually trust? If you were sitting where I am, reading a 2,500-year-old account written by a Greek historian who had never set foot in the deep Sahara himself, who was retelling stories that had already passed through several sets of ears before reaching him, would you take it as literal fact? Or would you wonder how much got exaggerated, translated, or simply misunderstood along the way? Modern scholars are divided on this exact question, and it is important to say clearly here that this part of the story remains genuinely debated, not settled. Some researchers argue that the Herodotus passage really does describe a form of slave raiding against black African populations to the south, and they point to actual physical evidence to support that reading. Saharan rock art found in the region does show images of chariots, matching Herodotus's description almost eerily well, as if the artists themselves had witnessed these hunts and wanted to record them in stone. Other scholars, including researchers such as Sonia and Carlos Magnavita, who examined this question in detail, have suggested that reading these lines as clear evidence of organized slave raiding might be a step too far, an interpretation shaped more by later assumptions than by what the original text actually proves. As they themselves acknowledged, though, hunting people for a purpose other than capturing them is also hard to imagine, which leaves the question frustratingly open rather than neatly resolved. So here is where we have to be honest with each other. This particular thread of the Garamantes story, the chariot hunts, the identity of the so-called troglodytes, whether this was systematic slavery or something else entirely, is still, today, a theory under active debate among historians and archaeologists. It has not been definitively proven either way. What we can say with more confidence is that later in their history, the Garamantes were unquestionably involved in trans-Saharan trade that did include the movement of enslaved people, a fact that comes not from a single ambiguous ancient quote, but from a much wider body of evidence that we will get to shortly. But notice what just happened in the story. Before the Garamantes had even fully entered the historical record, before we know almost anything certain about their language, their government, or their daily lives, they were already being described in dramatic, morally loaded terms by outsiders who barely understood them. That pattern being seen through someone else's eyes, judged by someone else's standards, filtered through someone else's fears and assumptions, would follow the Garamantes for the rest of their existence. And honestly, it followed them for almost 2,000 years after their kingdom finally collapsed. For a very long time, in fact, this is essentially all the outside world thought it knew about them. A dangerous desert tribe, raiders in chariots, a footnote in someone else's history. But the Garamantes were not a footnote. They were building something extraordinary underneath the desert floor, something so massive in scale that, when it was finally understood by modern researchers, it completely rewrote what anyone thought was possible for a civilization living in the middle of the Sahara. And that is where things start to get genuinely astonishing. Let's try to picture the underground engineering the Garamantes actually built, because the raw numbers alone do not do it justice unless you can first see the mechanism in your mind. Imagine a slope of rock and sand rising gently away from a valley floor. Somewhere deep inside that slope, buried under layers of stone, there is a hidden layer of water-soaked rock, the aquifer, sitting at a certain height. Now imagine that the valley floor itself sits lower than that underground water layer. If you could somehow connect the two, cut a channel from the water-bearing rock down into the valley, gravity alone would do the rest. Water would flow on its own, no pumps, no machines, no animals turning a wheel, simply because it was moving from a higher point to a lower one, guided the whole way through a tunnel carved beneath the surface. That is essentially the principle behind the underground channels the Garamantes built, called fagaras. It is closely related to a technology known elsewhere in the ancient world as qanats, and the general concept is believed to have reached the Garamantes through contact along trade routes stretching back toward Persia and Egypt, where similar underground irrigation systems had already been developed. But knowing the principle and actually executing it, at the scale the Garamantes achieved in that particular landscape, are two very different things. Here is the part that should genuinely stop you in your tracks. According to archaeological surveys, the Garamantes did not dig one tunnel or a handful of tunnels. They dug hundreds. Researchers have identified roughly 600 separate fagara systems in the region. And when you add together the total combined length of every underground channel and every vertical access shaft, the figure comes out to somewhere around 750 kilometers of tunnels carved directly into the earth. Some estimates that include every connecting passage push the total network even higher, toward figures approaching several thousand kilometers when every fork and branch is counted. Think about that scale for a moment. 750 kilometers is roughly the distance you would travel driving from London to the south of France, or from New York City most of the way to Detroit. Now imagine that entire distance, not as a road on the surface, but as a network of narrow tunnels dug underground, through sand, through gravel, through solid rock in places, using hand tools, in a climate where daytime temperatures regularly soar past what most human bodies can safely endure. And they did not stop at digging the tunnels themselves. To dig and later maintain such long underground channels, workers needed a way to remove debris and let air and light reach the diggers below. So at intervals of roughly every 9 or 10 meters along each tunnel, the Garamantes cut a vertical shaft straight down from the surface to meet the channel underneath. Archaeologists have documented something on the order of 100,000 of these vertical shafts across the whole system, some as shallow as 9 meters deep, others plunging down nearly 40 meters into the earth. From above, in aerial and satellite photographs, these shafts create long lines of small dark circles marching across the desert in perfectly measured rows, almost like strings of beads laid across the sand. It is one of the details that first made modern researchers, using satellite imagery, realize just how enormous and how deliberately engineered this system truly was. Now, pause here for a second and really sit with what this construction project actually required. This was not a task completed by a few skilled specialists over a couple of seasons. Researchers who have tried to calculate the total labor involved have estimated that building the known network of fagaras required something in the range of 70,000 years of combined human labor, spread out, of course, over generations, but still representing an almost unimaginable investment of human effort, sweat, and time. If you needed one single fact to justify calling this an engineering marvel on par with the pyramids of Egypt or the geoglyphs of Nazca, this would be it. Except that, unlike the pyramids, which stand in plain sight for anyone to marvel at, the Garamantes built their greatest achievement in a place no one was ever meant to see, hidden beneath the ground, invisible from above, silent, patient, doing its work in the dark for century after century. But who actually did this digging? Because someone had to be down there, in tunnels sometimes barely 2 feet wide and 5 feet high, cutting through rock in total darkness, in extreme heat, with the very real danger of tunnels collapsing overhead. That question leads us straight into one of the more uncomfortable truths about how this desert kingdom actually functioned. And it is a truth that connects directly back to that earlier, unresolved question about chariots and captives in the Herodotus story. Because it turns out the Garamantes' extraordinary engineering achievement and their extraordinary appetite for captured human labor were not two separate threads of their history. They were, according to most researchers, deeply, uncomfortably intertwined. By the time the Garamantian kingdom reached the height of its power, it had become one of the central hubs of trans-Saharan trade, a kind of crossroads economy connecting the interior of Africa with the Mediterranean world. Caravans moved through Garamantian territory carrying gold, semi-precious stones, and salt, one of the most valuable commodities in the ancient world, since it was essential for preserving food, and quite literally, for human survival. But archaeologists and historians studying Roman-era trade records agree that gold and salt were not the only goods moving along these routes. Enslaved people were also part of that trade, transported in caravans that traveled from cities like Garama, the Garamantes capital, north across the desert toward the Mediterranean coast, where they entered wider Roman networks that carried them onward through ports like Alexandria and Roman Carthage, and eventually into Europe and the Near East. Roman sources specifically associated certain populations described as Ethiopians within the empire with the Garamantes, suggesting that Roman society had at least some direct familiarity with sub-Saharan Africans by way of Garamantian trade connections. Historical evidence suggests that a significant portion of this particular trade in enslaved people involved children. Now here's where the story loops back and connects with everything we just discussed about the underground tunnels. According to Oxford archaeologist Andrew Wilson, who has spent years surveying the Sahara system in the field, the combination of the Garamantes' access to enslaved labor and their mastery of Sahara engineering is precisely what allowed them to achieve a standard of living far beyond anything else in the ancient Sahara. Digging hundreds of kilometers of tunnels by hand, in extreme heat, in narrow, unstable passages deep underground, required an enormous, continuous supply of labor. And historians generally agree that enslaved workers made up a substantial part of that labor force. Wilson has argued, quite directly, that without access to that forced labor, the Garamantes would likely have survived only at a much more modest level of prosperity, much like other desert-edge societies before and since them. Let's slow down here, because I think this deserves a genuine moment of reflection rather than just rushing past it as one more historical fact. If you were a Garamantian ruler, sitting on the edge of an ocean of sand, discovering that fossil water lay hidden beneath the ground, and realizing that reaching it required a nearly impossible amount of grueling physical labor, what would you do? Would you rely purely on your own people's labor, generation after generation, accepting a slower pace of growth? Or would you look outward, toward trade routes, toward captives, toward any available source of manpower, and use it to build faster, bigger, and more ambitiously than anyone thought possible in that landscape? History suggests the Garamantes chose the second path, and it is worth sitting with the uncomfortable truth that one of the most impressive engineering achievements in the ancient world was, at least in significant part, built on the backs of people who had no choice in the matter at all. This is not a detail to gloss over in service of a more triumphant story. It is part of the story itself, and honestly, it is a pattern that appears again and again throughout human history, wherever extraordinary monuments rise out of ordinary suffering. But there's another layer to this that is easy to miss on a first pass through the story. This system of enslaved labor and long-distance trade did more than just build tunnels. It built an entire urban civilization, and that civilization did not just survive in the Sahara. For thoughtful researchers, that alone raises another question worth sitting with. How do you build cities, real cities with markets, temples, tombs, and multi-story buildings, in a place with no permanent surface water at all? That question brings us to Garama itself, the Garamantian capital, and to the wider network of settlements the Garamantes built across their desert kingdom. And once you actually walk through what archaeologists have found there, it becomes almost impossible to keep thinking of the Garamantes as simple wandering desert tribes. Because what they built, hidden away in the Fazan for so long that most of the outside world forgot it had ever existed, was something that looked, by any reasonable definition, like a genuine civilization. For a long time, the standard picture of the Garamantes, inherited straight from Greek and Roman writers, was of a scattered, nomadic desert people, moving from place to place, never really settling down, never building anything permanent. That picture turned out to be almost entirely wrong, and the evidence that overturned it came not from ancient texts, but from decades of patient archaeological fieldwork carried out largely in the 20th and early 21st centuries. What researchers eventually uncovered was a genuinely urbanized society. At the center of it stood the capital, Garama, known today by its modern name, Jerma, located along the Wadi al-Ajal, a long valley depression in the Fazan region of what is now southwestern Libya. Alongside Garama stood other significant urban centers, including Zinchara and Saniat Jebel. And beyond those major cities, archaeologists have identified roughly 20 additional settlements scattered across Garamantes territory. At the height of their power, sometime around 150 CE, the Garamantes kingdom is estimated to have covered an area of roughly 180,000 square kilometers, an extraordinary territorial footprint for a society operating entirely within one of the harshest environments on the planet. Estimates of the total population, drawn from the density and extent of settlement remains, suggest the kingdom may have supported as many as 50,000 people at its peak. A genuinely astonishing figure for a civilization built entirely around a network of hand-dug irrigation tunnels in the middle of the Sahara. And these were not simple mud huts scattered loosely across the sand. Excavations at Garama and other sites have revealed multi-story stone and mud brick buildings, fortified structures, and elaborate tomb complexes, including pyramid-shaped and stepped tombs that echo, whether by direct influence or independent development, the funerary architecture of ancient Egypt further to the east. Grave goods recovered from Garamantes burial sites include imported Roman glassware, ceramics, and other luxury items. Physical proof that this was a society deeply plugged into long-distance trade networks, stretching all the way to the Mediterranean world. Not an isolated backwater cut off from the currents of history. Feeding a population of this size, in this location, required serious agricultural sophistication. And this is exactly where the Fagara system we discussed earlier proved its true value. With water reliably flowing down from the aquifer into irrigated fields, Garamantes farmers cultivated a genuinely diverse range of crops. Cereals such as wheat and barley, along with sorghum and millet, plus fruit crops including grapes, olives, figs, and especially dates, which thrived in the desert climate and became one of the defining crops of the region. Archaeological evidence also points to a livestock-based diet supplementing this agriculture, with the remains of cattle, sheep, and pigs found at Garamantes sites, suggesting that a Garamantes dinner table, at least for those with means, might have included roasted meat alongside fresh dates, olives, and locally grown grain. An almost unimaginable menu to picture rising out of the middle of the Sahara Desert. Here's a moment worth pausing on, because it captures something important about how easy it is to underestimate a civilization simply because it does not resemble the ones we already know. If someone described this society to you without naming it, a network of fortified cities, multi-story buildings, elaborate pyramid tombs, imported luxury goods, a diverse agricultural economy, and a population in the tens of thousands, all connected by a sophisticated irrigation infrastructure, you would probably assume they were describing a well-known ancient civilization, something already covered extensively in history textbooks. Instead, this description belongs to a kingdom that most people alive today have never once heard mentioned. And there's a reason for that gap, one that goes beyond simple obscurity. For most of the modern era, the very sources historians relied on to understand the ancient world, Greek and Roman writers, who viewed the Garamantes primarily as a distant, semi-hostile desert people, simply were not equipped, or perhaps not inclined, to recognize the level of sophistication that lay hidden beneath the sand. It took actual excavation, actual satellite imagery, actual careful measurement of tunnels and shafts and city walls to finally reveal the truth. The written record alone, left behind by outsiders who rarely, if ever, set foot deep in Garamantian territory, was never going to be enough. But building an empire of this scale in the middle of the Sahara inevitably meant colliding with other powers who also wanted a stake in the region's wealth and trade routes. And the largest, most dangerous power on the Garamantian horizon was, of course, Rome. That collision did not happen quietly. It happened through raids, retaliation, full military campaigns, and eventually the fall of the Garamantian capital itself, not once, but on more than one occasion, centuries apart. And it all started, as these things so often do, with the Garamantes deciding that Rome's coastal settlements looked like fair targets for a raid. By the time Rome had crushed Carthage and established firm control over the North African coastline, the Garamantes were already a familiar name to Roman writers, and not always a welcome one. Roman accounts describe the Garamantes as bearing distinctive ritual scars and tattoos, physical markers that set them visually apart from the Romans and other North African peoples the empire had already absorbed. More importantly for Rome's purposes, the historian Tacitus recorded that the Garamantes assisted a rebel leader named Tacfarinas during his uprising against Roman authority in North Africa, and that Garamantian raiders struck at Roman coastal settlements, testing the limits of Roman patience along the empire's southern frontier. According to Pliny the Elder, Rome eventually grew tired of these repeated raids. In 19 BCE, the Roman proconsul Lucius Cornelius Balbus led a substantial military force, numbering in the thousands, deep into Libyan territory, specifically to punish the Garamantes for their rebellious activity. Balbus's campaign was not a token gesture. According to ancient accounts, he first conquered the town of Gadames, then pushed onward toward Garama itself, the Garamantian capital, and successfully captured it along with a number of other Garamantian settlements, with ancient sources placing the total captured settlements at around 15. Some accounts even suggest that Balbus's forces pressed further south still, penetrating deep enough into the African interior to reach territory believed by later geographers to be near the Niger River, an almost unbelievable distance for a Roman military expedition to have traveled at that point in history, deep into terrain the Romans had never previously mapped or controlled. Now here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If you were a Garamantian ruler in the aftermath of that campaign, watching a foreign army march straight into your capital city, and out the other side toward lands you yourself may never have personally visited, what would you conclude about the balance of power between your kingdom and Rome? Would you assume this was the end of Garamantian independence? Or would you gamble that Rome, having made its point, had no real interest in permanently occupying a desert kingdom so far removed from the Mediterranean coast, and that your people could simply rebuild once the legions withdrew? History suggests the second read was closer to correct, at least for a while. Balbus's campaign, however dramatic, was fundamentally a punitive expedition rather than a war of conquest and occupation. Rome had neither the interest nor, frankly, the logistical capacity to permanently garrison a kingdom scattered across the deep Sahara, hundreds of kilometers south of anything resembling a reliable Roman supply line. So the Garamantes endured, rebuilt, and continued much as before, trading, farming, occasionally raiding, occupying an uneasy but workable position on the southern edge of the Roman world. For roughly 2 centuries after Balbus's campaign, relations between Rome and the Garamantes settled into something closer to an uneasy, transactional peace, built primarily around trade rather than conflict. But that peace was not permanent. In 202 CE, the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus, who himself came from Roman North Africa and had a personal familiarity with the region's dynamics, launched another major campaign against the Garamantes. This time, Roman forces succeeded in capturing Garama itself once again, striking directly at the symbolic and administrative heart of the Garamantian kingdom for a second time in its history. And yet, even after this second devastating blow to their capital, the Garamantes did not simply collapse and disappear. Perhaps the most remarkable indicator of their continued influence during this period comes from an episode recorded by Roman geographers. A Roman traveler named Julius Maternus is said to have journeyed alongside the king of the Garamantes on an extended expedition deep into inner Africa, eventually reaching a region called Ajasimba after a journey that reportedly lasted around 4 months, traveling south from Garama. According to the account, the Garamantian king himself claimed sovereignty over Ajasimba and its inhabitants, presenting the peoples he encountered there as subjects during what appears to have been a military or diplomatic campaign, pushing Garamantian influence even further south into the African interior. Sit with that for a second, because it flips the entire narrative we might expect. This was not a broken, defeated kingdom limping along in Rome's shadow after 2 humiliating military defeats. This was a kingdom still confident enough, still resourced enough, and still ambitious enough to be projecting its own power hundreds of kilometers further south into Africa, claiming new territory and new subject peoples of its own, apparently around the same era that Rome had just captured their own capital city. That resilience, that stubborn capacity to keep functioning as a genuine regional power, even after direct military defeat, is honestly one of the most underappreciated aspects of the entire Garamantian story. But resilience against a human enemy, however strong, is a very different thing from resilience against a slower, quieter, far more permanent kind of threat. Because while Rome's legions came and went, leaving Garama battered but still standing, there was another force working against the Garamantes the entire time, one that no army, no fortress wall, and no diplomatic alliance could ever hope to defeat. That force was the desert itself, and more specifically, the ancient water hidden beneath it, the very same fossil water the Garamantes had built their entire civilization around. Because fossil water, unlike rainfall, does not refill itself. And after roughly 600 years of continuous extraction, the Garamantes were about to discover exactly what happens when you build an empire on a resource that can never be replaced. Let's return, for a moment, to that image of fossil water we described earlier, an ancient underground ocean, sealed away since the days when the Sahara was still green, untouched for thousands of years, until Garamantian engineers finally found a way to reach it. That water made the entire Garamantian civilization possible. But there is a critical difference between fossil water and the kind of water most agricultural societies throughout history have relied on. A river fed by mountain snowmelt refills every spring. A rainfall-based aquifer slowly recharges every wet season. Fossil water does neither of these things. Once it is extracted, it is, for all practical human timescales, simply gone. According to the same research presented by Ohio State University geologist Frank Schwartz and his colleagues, over the roughly 600 years, the Garamantian Fagara system operated at scale. The Garamantes extracted something on the order of 30 billion gallons of water from the aquifer beneath their territory. 30 billion gallons sounds abstract until you try to picture it. Enough water to fill tens of thousands of Olympic-sized swimming pools, drawn slowly, tunnel by tunnel, shaft by shaft, out of rock that had been holding it since long before the pyramids of Egypt were built. For a long time, that extraction rate was sustainable enough, or at least survivable enough, for the kingdom to thrive. But an aquifer, no matter how vast, is not infinite. And by the 4th century CE, the Garamantes began to encounter a problem that no amount of political skill, military resilience, or trade wealth could solve. The water, quite literally, was running out. Here's where I want to ask you directly. If you were living in Garama in the 4th century, watching the flow through the ancient Fagara channels slowly, gradually weaken, year after year, generation after generation, what would you do? Would you understand what was happening, that the very foundation your entire civilization had been built upon for 6 centuries was quietly draining away beneath your feet? Or would it feel less like a slow-motion catastrophe and more like a string of unlucky years, each one a little worse than the last, without any single dramatic moment to point to as the beginning of the end? Archaeological and geological evidence suggests it was almost certainly the second experience, a slow, creeping decline rather than a sudden collapse. To keep their irrigation system functioning as the water table dropped, the Garamantes would have needed to dig new tunnels reaching even deeper into the aquifer, extending existing fagaras farther and farther underground to chase water that kept retreating further out of reach. That is an enormously demanding engineering response, even under ideal conditions, and the Garamantes were attempting it after centuries of continuous digging, had already extracted a significant portion of the easily accessible water, using a labor system that itself depended heavily on trade routes and captured workers that were increasingly strained by the kingdom's declining fortunes. It is worth being honest here that historians and scientists do not present a single, universally agreed-upon account of exactly how and why the Garamantian kingdom ultimately declined. Some researchers point primarily toward this depletion of fossil water as the central, decisive factor. Others emphasize broader worsening climatic conditions across the wider Sahara during this period, conditions that would have compounded the pressure on an already strained water system. Most current scholarship treats these explanations not as competing theories, but as intertwined forces: environmental depletion, climatic shifts, and centuries of unsustainable extraction, working together to slowly erode the foundation the Garamantian kingdom had been built upon. This part of the story remains in the honest language of ongoing research, not yet fully resolved, an active area of scientific and historical investigation rather than a closed case. But whatever the precise combination of causes, the outcome was unmistakable. Over the following centuries, Garamantian civilization gradually faded from the historical record. Cities that had once supported tens of thousands of people, that had built pyramid tombs and imported Roman glassware, and successfully weathered 2 Roman military campaigns against their own capital, slowly emptied out, their populations dispersing, their once thriving Fagara networks falling silent as the tunnels dried, and eventually collapsed in on themselves, unmaintained, forgotten, buried by the very sand they had spent centuries holding back. There is something almost unbearably poignant about that image, if you let yourself sit with it. A civilization that had triumphed over the desert itself, that had found water where nature seemingly offered none, that had built cities and fought empires, and sent its own king on a 4-month expedition deep into inner Africa, was ultimately undone not by an invading army, not by a single catastrophic battle, but by the simple, patient, unstoppable arithmetic of a resource that could never be replaced once it was gone. And for well over 1,000 years after that quiet, gradual ending, almost nobody in the wider world knew any of this had ever happened. The tunnels lay buried and silent beneath the sand. The cities crumbled into low mounds barely distinguishable from the surrounding desert. And the Garamantes themselves became little more than a strange, half-believed footnote in a handful of surviving Greek and Roman texts, remembered, if remembered at all, primarily for chariots and captives, rather than for aquifers and engineering. It would take the arrival of modern archaeology, and eventually satellites orbiting hundreds of kilometers above the Earth, to finally bring their real story back into the light. For roughly 14 centuries after the last Sahara stopped flowing, the Garamantes existed only as a rumor trapped inside old books, a strange half-remembered mention in Herodotus, a name in Roman military records, a kingdom that historians could locate only approximately on a map, somewhere in the vast, unmapped blankness of the central Sahara. Nobody had excavated their capital. Nobody had traced their tunnels. For all practical purposes, they were a story about a place, rather than a place that had actually been studied. That began to change in the 19th century, when a French explorer named Henri Duverrier managed to firmly connect the ancient Garamantes described in classical texts with the actual geographic region of the Fezzan in southwestern Libya, finally anchoring a name from ancient literature to real coordinates on a real map. But identifying where they had lived was very different from actually digging into the ground to find out what they had left behind. That work, the real archaeological rediscovery, would not properly begin until an Italian mission arrived in the region in 1933, followed decades later by larger excavation efforts in the 1960s. The person most responsible for turning the Garamantes from a historical curiosity into a properly documented ancient civilization was a British archaeologist named Charles Daniels, who led excavation and survey work across the region from roughly 1958 through 1977. Daniels dug into the heart of ancient Garama itself, and what he found there directly contradicted the old Roman stereotype of wandering desert raiders. Beneath the layers of later mud brick construction, Daniels uncovered a core of genuinely monumental architecture built from quality cut stone, including what appears to have been a temple, approached by a broad staircase, and a columned entrance porch, possibly dedicated to a desert god associated with the famous oracle at Siwa, the very oracle Alexander the Great once traveled deep into the desert to consult. Nearby, Daniels found the remains of a grand colonnaded courtyard building and fragments of hypocaust tiles, hydraulic cement, and painted wall plaster that strongly suggested the presence of a Roman-style bathhouse. Right there, in the middle of a desert capital that ancient writers had barely bothered to describe in any real detail. Daniels passed away in 1996 with a significant amount of his research still unpublished. But his work did not disappear with him. A new research effort, known as the Fezzan Project, was established under archaeologist David Mattingly, running fieldwork from 1997 through 2001, under the joint direction of the Society for Libyan Studies in London and Libya's own Department of Antiquities. Mattingly's team returned to systematically document, publish, and expand upon everything Daniels had uncovered decades earlier, eventually producing a landmark multi-volume publication that finally gave the wider academic world detailed, rigorous access to the full scope of Garamantian civilization. Its architecture, its irrigation technology, its trade goods, its burial practices, all of it laid out with a level of precision no one had managed before. And this is where the story takes one more genuinely remarkable turn, because the final piece of the puzzle did not come from a shovel in the sand at all. It came from hundreds of kilometers up, in orbit around the Earth. Because so many Garamantes settlements sit in remote stretches of desert that have seen little or no direct ground excavation. Researchers working on later stages of this project increasingly turned to satellite imagery to map out entire urban landscapes from above, without ever needing to physically walk every single site. From that vantage point, the long lines of small circular depressions marking vertical Sahara shafts became visible, stretching for kilometers across the desert floor. Precise, evenly spaced, undeniably artificial. A signature written into the landscape itself that no natural process could have produced. It was this kind of aerial and satellite evidence, combined with decades of ground survey data, that ultimately allowed researchers like geologist Frank Schwartz and his colleagues, presenting findings as recently as 2023 at the Geological Society of America's GSA Connects meeting, to finally calculate the true scale of the system. The full extent of the tunnel network, the total volume of water extracted, and the environmental story of how a hidden civilization rose and eventually fell, entirely around a resource literally invisible from the surface. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment before we move any further. It took modern satellite technology, orbiting the planet at speeds of thousands of kilometers per hour, to finally reveal, in full, an engineering system that had been dug entirely by hand, tunnel by tunnel, roughly 2,000 years earlier, by workers who never had access to a single piece of equipment more advanced than a hand tool and their own physical strength. There is something almost humbling in that gap, the distance between what those ancient hands accomplished in darkness and heat and what it eventually took modern science, sitting comfortably in orbit, to finally appreciate the full scale of what they had built. And once that scale was finally understood, it forced a genuine reckoning. Because everything we had assumed about who could build a civilization, and where, and under what conditions, turned out to be wrong. Let's step back from the tunnels and the tombs for a moment and ask a more basic question, one that turns out to be surprisingly difficult to answer with confidence. Who were the Garamantes, really, in terms of where they came from and how their society was actually organized? This is another one of those places in the story where honest historians have to say, clearly, that the picture remains genuinely debated rather than settled. Researchers generally classify the Garamantes as a Berber people, part of the broader family of indigenous North African populations that includes many groups still living across the region today. But the deeper question of their precise origins, whether they emerged primarily from local Neolithic populations who had lived in the Fazan since the wetter, greener period of the Sahara, or whether their society formed through a more complex blending of local groups, with newer arrivals moving into the region over time, remains an active area of scholarly discussion rather than a fully closed question. This is a piece of the story that deserves an honest flag. This is a theory still being tested and refined, not an established fact carved in stone. What has seemed clearer, based on archaeological evidence, is that Garamantes society was not simply egalitarian or loosely organized. The presence of elaborate stepped and pyramid-shaped tombs, some clearly more elaborate and resource-intensive than others, points toward a genuinely stratified society, one with rulers, elites, and likely a substantial underclass that almost certainly included the enslaved laborers who dug so much of the Sahara network. Grave goods recovered from richer tombs, imported Roman glass, fine ceramics, personal ornaments, stand in sharp contrast to simpler burials found elsewhere in the same cemeteries. A pattern archaeologists typically read as strong evidence of real, meaningful social and economic inequality within Garamantian communities. There is also evidence, though again incomplete, that the Garamantes developed their own form of writing. Inscriptions found at Garamantian sites appear related to the broader Libico-Berber script tradition, an ancient writing system connected to the Tifinagh script still used by some Berber groups, including the Tuareg, in parts of North Africa today. Unfortunately, unlike the deeply studied hieroglyphics of Egypt or the cuneiform tablets of Mesopotamia, this Garamantian script has not been comprehensively deciphered and studied to the same degree, which means many aspects of Garamantian religious belief, political structure, and daily thought remain frustratingly out of reach, locked inside inscriptions that modern researchers can only partially interpret. Now here is a moment worth pausing on and really thinking through for yourself. If you were an archaeologist standing over a beautifully carved but only partially readable inscription, carved by a hand that lived and died almost 2,000 years ago, in a language your team can only partly translate, how would that feel? Frustrating, certainly. But also, in a strange way, humbling. A direct reminder that even with satellite imagery, radiocarbon dating, and decades of careful excavation, there are still parts of this civilization's inner life, their beliefs, their fears, their sense of humor, their private hopes, that remain genuinely, permanently out of reach. We can map every single one of their 100,000 irrigation shafts with satellite precision, and still not fully know what a Garamantian priest actually said during a funeral at one of those pyramid tombs. That temple Charles Daniels uncovered at Garama, the one possibly dedicated to a desert god connected to the famous oracle at Siwa, hints at a religious life that connected the Garamantes to wider North African and even broader Mediterranean spiritual traditions, rather than existing in complete isolation. And the sheer effort invested in constructing elaborate pyramid and stepped tombs suggests that Garamantian beliefs about death and the afterlife mattered enough to justify significant communal resources and labor, much as similar funerary ambitions did in ancient Egypt further to the east. But we should be careful here not to overstate the parallel. The pyramid-shaped tombs of the Garamantes, while visually reminiscent of Egyptian funerary architecture, developed within their own distinct cultural context, in a kingdom separated from the Nile Valley by enormous distances and centuries of independent historical development. Whether this architectural similarity reflects direct cultural influence traveling along ancient trade routes, or simply reflects two different societies independently arriving at similar solutions to similar spiritual and practical problems. Building upward, building permanently, building to be remembered, is, again, a question that current scholarship has not definitively resolved. What all of this adds up to is a picture of a society that was, in every meaningful sense, genuinely complex. Not simple, not primitive, not merely a band of desert raiders with a talent for chariot warfare, as ancient Greek and Roman writers so often implied. A stratified society, with elites and laborers, with religious institutions, with its own writing system, with monumental architecture, with sophisticated engineering, and with deep, active connections to trade networks stretching from sub-Saharan Africa all the way to the heart of the Roman Mediterranean. But complexity and sophistication did not make the Garamantes invincible, and it certainly did not make them immune to one of the oldest and cruelest patterns in human history, the way that a society's greatest strength can, given enough time, quietly transform into its greatest vulnerability. Let's go back one more time to that rock art scattered across the mountains and plateaus surrounding the old Garamantes heartland, because there is more to it than just the chariot images that seem to confirm parts of Herodotus's account. Across the wider Sahara, rock art spans an enormous stretch of time, reaching back to that much older Green Sahara period we described at the very beginning of this story, when the region was still full of lakes and grasslands, and the animals that depended on them. Earlier layers of Saharan rock art depict cattle herding scenes, wild game, and a landscape utterly unlike the desert that exists there today. A kind of frozen visual archive of an environment that had already vanished long before the Garamantes themselves ever existed. Layered on top of, or alongside, those older images, later rock art from the region includes depictions connected more directly to the Garamantes period. Among them, those now famous images of horse-drawn chariots. For a long time, these chariot engravings were treated almost as a smoking gun, physical proof, carved directly into stone, that seemed to confirm Herodotus's description of Garamantes raiders chasing down captives across the desert. And to be fair, the match between the ancient written account and the ancient carved image is genuinely striking. It is rare in archaeology to have a written description and a piece of physical art line up so closely across such an enormous span of time and distance. But even here, in a rare case where text and image seem to reinforce one another so cleanly, historians urge real caution before treating the match as absolute proof. Rock art can be difficult to date with precision. The specific purpose behind any given carving, ceremonial, historical record, artistic expression, symbolic warning, is rarely something we can determine with total confidence just by looking at the image itself, centuries or millennia after it was made. So while the chariot imagery does lend real support to the idea that fast, mobile raiding parties were part of Garamantes military and economic life, exactly who was being pursued in those particular scenes, and for what precise purpose, remains, once again, a genuinely contested question rather than a settled fact. If you were the one standing in front of that rock face today, tracing the outline of a 2,000-year-old chariot with your fingertip, would you feel confident enough to declare exactly what story it was meant to tell? Most archaeologists, when they are being fully honest, will tell you they are not. What we can say with much greater confidence, because it comes from a much broader body of physical, archaeological, and documentary evidence, rather than a single contested passage, or a single ambiguous rock carving, is that mobility itself was absolutely central to how the Garamantes operated as a civilization. Their entire economy depended on long-distance movement, caravans crossing brutal stretches of open desert to connect the Fazan with both the Mediterranean coast to the north and the sub-Saharan regions to the south. Horses, and later, increasingly, camels, made that kind of extended movement across hostile terrain possible in the first place. Without the ability to move goods, people, and information across truly enormous distances, the Garamantes could never have become trading power they clearly were, the wealth reflected in those richly furnished tombs, the imported Roman glass, the connections extensive enough for a Garamantes king to personally lead a Roman traveler on a 4-month expedition deep into inner Africa, simply would not have been possible. It is worth pausing here to really appreciate just how remarkable that logistical capability actually was, on its own terms, entirely separate from the debate over chariots and captives. Organizing caravans capable of crossing some of the most hostile terrain on the planet, coordinating the water, food, and security needed to keep traders, animals, and cargo alive across weeks of travel through open desert, required exactly the same kind of disciplined, long-term planning that built those hundreds of kilometers of underground irrigation tunnels. In both cases, the Garamantes were solving the same fundamental problem: how to move a scarce, precious resource, whether that resource was water or trade goods, across a landscape that actively worked to destroy anything trying to cross it. Seen that way, the underground Sahara network and the overland caravan routes were not two separate Garamantian achievements, sitting side by side. They were really two expressions of the very same underlying genius, an entire civilization organized, at every level, around the difficult, patient art of moving something valuable through a landscape that offered almost no help at all in doing so. And that brings us, gradually, back around to the question we have been circling since the very beginning of this story. What does it actually mean that a civilization this capable, this resourceful, this genuinely impressive by almost any measure, still, in the end, ran out of the one resource it could never manufacture, negotiate for, or fight a war to protect? Here is where the story does something that most ancient history documentaries never quite manage to do. It reaches forward, out of the deep past, and taps you directly on the shoulder in the present day. Because the very same fossil water that made the Garamantian civilization possible, the very same ancient aquifer system lying beneath the Fazan and stretching out under Libya, Egypt, Chad, and Sudan, known today as the Nubian sandstone aquifer system, is still there. It never disappeared. It is, according to hydrologists, the largest known fossil water aquifer system on Earth, holding an estimated 150,000 cubic kilometers of groundwater, water that, in some parts of the system, has been sitting underground since before the last ice age. And in the 20th century, an entirely different desert power looked at that same ancient water and had essentially the same idea the Garamantes had, just with modern machinery instead of hand tools and enslaved labor. In the early 1950s, oil exploration teams working in the deserts of southern Libya stumbled onto enormous reserves of fresh groundwater sitting beneath the sand, alongside the oil deposits everyone had actually been searching for. Decades later, under the government of Muammar Gaddafi, Libya launched what became known as the Great Man-Made River Project, an almost unimaginably ambitious engineering effort to pump that same ancient fossil water, in some places accumulated roughly 40,000 years ago, up from deep wells in the southern desert, and pipe it across thousands of kilometers of buried pipeline to the populous coastal cities of northern Libya. Gaddafi himself once called it the eighth wonder of the world. Whatever you think of that description, or of the government that built it, the sheer engineering ambition is difficult to argue with. Thousands of kilometers of underground pipeline, well over 1,000 deep wells, delivering millions of cubic meters of water every single day to cities that would otherwise struggle to survive on their own coastal water supplies. Now here's the part of this comparison that should genuinely give you pause. And here's a question worth asking yourself directly, the way you might ask a friend sitting next to you watching this unfold. If a nearly 2,000-year-old desert kingdom eventually exhausted its accessible fossil water after roughly 6 centuries of extraction, using nothing but hand tools and gravity-fed tunnels, what do you imagine happens to that same finite, non-renewing resource when it is instead being pumped out using powerful modern machinery at an industrial scale to supply the daily water needs of millions of people living in major cities? Hydrologists and engineers who have studied the modern Great Man-Made River Project have raised exactly that concern. Because fossil water, whether it is being drawn up through a hand-dug Sahara tunnel 2,000 years ago or through a modern steel-cased borehole today, remains fossil water. It is not being replenished by current rainfall in any meaningful way. Some estimates suggest the system, at current rates of extraction, could theoretically continue supplying water for centuries. Other, more cautious estimates suggest depletion, or at least a serious decline in easily accessible reserves, could arrive within a matter of decades rather than centuries. As with the Garamantes collapse itself, this is very much an active, ongoing, unresolved question, one being debated right now by hydrologists and policymakers, not a settled fact we can simply report as history. Sit with that parallel for a moment, because I think it is genuinely one of the most powerful threads running through this entire story. Two civilizations, separated by roughly 2,000 years, separated by hand tools versus industrial drilling rigs, separated by enslaved labor versus paid engineers and government contracts, arrived at essentially the same underlying strategy when faced with the same underlying problem. How do you build a thriving human society in a place where nature itself offers almost no water at all? And in both cases, the answer was the same. You find the ancient water hidden beneath your feet, and you take it. The Garamantes took roughly 6 centuries to exhaust the portion of that resource they could reach with the technology available to them. Modern industrial extraction moves immeasurably faster and reaches immeasurably deeper than anything a Garamantes engineer digging with hand tools could ever have imagined. Which raises an uncomfortable question that this documentary cannot answer for you, because honestly, nobody can answer it with full certainty yet. Are we, in some very real sense, watching the opening chapters of a story we have already seen the ending of once before? That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a genuinely open scientific and political question, one that hydrologists studying the Nubian sandstone aquifer system continue to actively research and debate today, in real time, as you are watching this. Let's try, for a moment, to actually step inside Garama itself, at the height of its power, sometime in the 2nd century CE, and picture what a single ordinary day there might have looked like, built entirely from what archaeology has actually shown us, rather than invented detail. The morning would begin, most likely, before the worst of the desert heat arrived, with farmers already moving out into the irrigated fields that ringed the city. Fields kept alive by water quietly flowing down through the Fagara channels from the aquifer beneath the escarpment to the south. Excavated plant remains from Garama confirm that these fields supported wheat and barley, along with sorghum and millet, crops requiring real, consistent irrigation to survive in this climate at all. Date palms would have lined many of these plots as well, their fruit both a dietary staple and, quite possibly, a trade good moving north along the caravan routes. Grapevines and olive trees, evidence for both found in the archaeobotanical record, suggest that wine and oil production were also part of the agricultural rhythm of the city, luxuries that placed Garama's farming economy in surprisingly close company with Mediterranean agricultural traditions, despite sitting hundreds of kilometers deep in the Sahara. Inside the city itself, most residents lived in mud brick houses, the standard building material for ordinary Garamantes homes according to the excavations led by Charles Daniels and later, continued by David Mattingly's Fazan project. But near the center of the city stood a very different kind of architecture entirely. Structures built from quality cut stone, ashlar masonry, a building technique demanding far more skill, time, and resources than simple mud brick construction. Among these stone buildings, Daniels identified what appears to have been a temple, approached by a broad staircase and a columned entrance, and a separate grand courtyard building whose scattered fragments, hypocaust tiles, hydraulic cement, painted wall plaster, strongly suggest the presence of a Roman-style heated bathhouse, an unmistakable symbol of wealth, status, and cultural connection to the wider Mediterranean world, sitting right there in the middle of the Sahara. If you had walked through Garamantes streets on a market day, you would very likely have encountered goods that had traveled extraordinary distances to reach you. Roman glassware and fine ceramics, recovered from Garamantian burial sites as grave goods, tell us that these were not rare, one-off luxury items reserved solely for royalty, but goods circulating widely enough within Garamantian society to end up buried alongside a meaningful number of the dead. Salt and gold, carried up from trade routes stretching deep into the African interior, would have passed through the city's markets as well, alongside, uncomfortably, captives being moved as part of the same trans-Saharan trade networks, human cargo treated, in the brutal economic logic of the ancient world, as simply another commodity, worth transporting. And beyond the edges of the city, out where the last irrigated fields gave way to open desert, the Fagara shafts themselves would have punctuated the landscape in long, precise rows, their small circular openings marking the invisible channels running beneath the ground. Maintaining this system was not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing, generational labor commitment. Sand had to be cleared. Collapsed sections had to be repaired. New extensions had to be dug as the water table shifted. The workers responsible for this maintenance, descending into narrow tunnels, sometimes barely wide enough to move through, working by touch and by the dim light filtering down from access shafts, spaced every few meters, were performing some of the most physically demanding, genuinely dangerous labor anywhere in the ancient world. And as we discussed earlier, historians generally agree that a substantial portion of this labor force consisted of people who had no choice in the matter at all. If you try to hold all of these images in your mind at once, the columned temple and the mud brick houses, the imported Roman glass and the enslaved tunnel diggers, the date palms and grapevines thriving in irrigated fields surrounded by nothing but hostile sand, you start to get a genuine sense of just how layered, how internally contradictory, and how remarkably sophisticated Garamantian civilization actually was. This was not a simple society. It was a society capable of enormous achievement and, at the very same time, enormous cruelty, sometimes within the very same infrastructure project, sometimes within the very same family's wealth, built as it likely was on trade profits that included the sale of other human beings. And that tension, that uncomfortable coexistence of genuine brilliance and genuine exploitation, is not unique to the Garamantes at all. If you look honestly at almost any ancient civilization capable of monumental achievement, Egypt, Rome, the great cities of Mesopotamia, you tend to find some version of the very same pattern underneath the surface. Extraordinary human accomplishment, resting, at least in part, on the forced labor of people who left behind no names, no inscriptions, no tombs of their own, only the tunnels, walls, and monuments they were made to build for someone else. So what actually happened after the water began to fail, after the great capital had been captured twice by Roman armies, after centuries of extraction had begun to outrun what the aquifer could easily provide? The kingdom did not vanish overnight, and it is worth being precise about this rather than reaching for a dramatic but inaccurate ending. What the evidence suggests is a long, uneven decline stretching across centuries, as worsening water access, likely combined with growing political fragmentation, gradually eroded the kingdom's ability to function as a unified state. Some researchers point to local defensive structures dating from this later period as possible evidence of exactly that fragmentation. a once unified kingdom splintering into smaller, competing chiefdoms as the central authority at Garama lost its grip on the resources that had once bound the whole system together. Eventually, in the wider historical currents that reshaped North Africa in late antiquity, the remnants of Garamantian society were absorbed into the emerging Islamic world that swept across the region in the centuries that followed. And here, right here, is one of the quietest, saddest details in this entire story. And it deserves to be said plainly rather than rushed past. According to researchers who have worked in the Fazan, many people living in the region today, descendants, in some real sense, of the very people who built this system, have largely forgotten the true origin of the ancient tunnels beneath their own land. Local tradition in parts of the region has, at times, attributed the Fagara network not to their own Garamantian ancestors, but to the Romans, the very empire that twice marched armies into Garama to conquer it. Think about the layers of irony packed into that single detail. A civilization that fought off, absorbed, and outlasted two direct Roman military campaigns against its own capital city, eventually became so thoroughly erased from local memory that its greatest engineering achievement got quietly credited to the empire it had once resisted. If you were a Garamantian engineer, watching your tunnels being dug shaft by shaft, generation by generation, and someone told you that 2,000 years later, people living on this very same land would forget your name and give credit to Rome instead, what would you feel? Frustration, probably. But maybe also something closer to a strange, weary recognition. Because if history teaches us anything, it is that memory is fragile, that even genuinely extraordinary achievements can be misattributed, forgotten, or simply buried under the sand of passing centuries, waiting for someone, eventually, to dig them back up. But the Garamantes did not disappear from the human record entirely, even if their name faded from local memory for a long time. Genetic and linguistic research increasingly points toward a real, direct connection between the ancient Garamantes and the Tuareg peoples who live across the wider Sahara today, including communities still living in the Fazan region itself. Studies of maternal and paternal genetic lineages among Libyan Tuareg populations have found patterns consistent with descent from an ancestral population, separating out around the time the Garamantian kingdom collapsed. And Tifinagh-related inscriptions found at Garama itself suggest that this ancient capital played a real role in shaping the linguistic and cultural identity that would eventually develop into Tuareg culture as we recognize it today. It is worth flagging honestly, once again, that questions of ancestry and ethnic continuity across 2,000 years of history are genuinely complex, and researchers continue to debate the precise details. But the broad connection between the Garamantes and today's Tuareg communities is supported by a real and growing body of both genetic and archaeological evidence, not simply romantic speculation. So in a very real sense, the Garamantes never fully vanished at all. Their tunnels collapsed. Their cities crumbled into low mounds. Their name faded from local memory so completely that their own descendants eventually credited their masterwork to a foreign empire. But somewhere in the language, the culture, and quite possibly the genetic heritage of the Tuareg people who still call the wider Sahara home today, something of the Garamantes endures, quietly, unglamorously, the way most human legacies actually survive, not through triumphant monuments still standing proudly in the sun, but through the much quieter thread of people simply continuing to live, generation after generation, in the same difficult, beautiful, unforgiving landscape their ancestors once learned to conquer. Let's take a step back now and gather up everything this story has actually shown us. because there is a real difference between simply listing facts about an ancient civilization and understanding why those facts matter. Why this particular desert kingdom deserves a place in how we think about human history at all. Start with the most basic, almost embarrassing observation. Most people alive today have never heard the name Garamantes. Ask someone about the pyramids of Egypt, and they will immediately picture the Sphinx, Giza, the golden mask of Tutankhamun. Ask about Rome, and an entire visual universe appears instantly: gladiators, senators, aqueducts, legions marching along stone roads. But ask about a civilization that built 750 kilometers of underground irrigation tunnels using hand tools, that supported a population of tens of thousands in the middle of the Sahara, that fought 2 separate wars against Rome and survived both, that sent its own king on a 4-month expedition deep into inner Africa. And you will very likely be met with silence. Why does a civilization this genuinely accomplished occupy so little space in popular historical memory? While other ancient societies, in some cases arguably less individually remarkable in terms of raw engineering achievement, remain instantly recognizable household names. Part of the answer, honestly, comes down to something as simple and as unfair as geography and the accident of who happened to be writing history at the time. The Garamantes left behind their own inscriptions, yes, but in a script that remains only partially deciphered, meaning that for most of the last 2,000 years, almost everything the wider world knew about them came filtered entirely through Greek and Roman writers. People who viewed the Garamantes primarily as a distant, semi-hostile frontier people, rather than as a civilization worth describing on its own terms. Herodotus gave us chariots and captives. Roman military historians gave us punitive campaigns and conquered settlements. Nobody sat down and wrote a careful, sympathetic account of Garamantian religious life. Garamantian family structures, Garamantian art for its own sake, the way ancient writers occasionally did for societies closer to the Mediterranean core. The Garamantes were, in the surviving textual record, almost always someone else's supporting character, rarely the protagonist of their own story. And this is exactly why modern archaeology mattered so much here, arguably more than it does for civilizations that already left behind rich literary traditions of their own. Without the patient work of Charles Daniels digging into Garama in the 1960s and 1970s, without David Mattingly's Fazan project painstakingly publishing and expanding on that earlier fieldwork decades later, without satellite imagery finally revealing the true scale of a tunnel network invisible from ground level, the Garamantes might still be, today, little more than that brief, unflattering mention in Herodotus, a footnote rather than a genuine civilization. If you take one thing away from this entire story, let it be this: the absence of a famous name does not mean the absence of a remarkable achievement. Somewhere beneath the sand of the Sahara, an entire sophisticated civilization was quietly building one of the most impressive pieces of engineering in the ancient world, and the rest of the world simply was not paying attention for 2,000 years, until satellites and careful excavation finally forced everyone to look. That should make you wonder, honestly, what else might still be buried out there. Not just in the Sahara, but in deserts, jungles, and remote mountain regions all over the planet, hidden achievements built by people's history simply failed to notice, or chose not to record, or recorded only through the dismissive, distorted lens of a distant, occasionally hostile outside observer. How many more Garamantes are still waiting under the sand somewhere, their tunnels silent, their tombs unopened, their names reduced to a single suspicious paragraph in someone else's ancient chronicle? And there is a second, more uncomfortable lesson sitting right alongside that first one, and it deserves just as much honesty. The Garamantes were not simply innocent victims of historical neglect, quietly minding their own desert business, while unfair outsiders mischaracterized them. Their civilization, as we discussed, was built, at least in significant part, on the forced labor of enslaved people, captured and moved through exactly the kind of trans-Saharan trade networks that also brought them their wealth, their imported Roman glass, their monumental temples. Recognizing the genuine brilliance of Garamantian engineering does not require pretending away the genuine cruelty embedded within the system that made it possible. Both things are true at the same time about the very say. Civilization, and honestly, holding both truths together, admiration for the achievement and clear-eyed acknowledgement of its human cost, is probably the most mature, most historically honest way to actually engage with a story like this one. So where does that leave us? Standing here at the end of a story that stretches from an ancient green Sahara full of lakes and grazing cattle, through centuries of patient tunnel digging in total darkness, through Roman legions marching on a desert capital not once, but twice, through a slow, quiet, unglamorous collapse driven by nothing more dramatic than water running out, all the way up to satellites in orbit finally revealing what had been hidden the entire time. It leaves us, I think, with a story that is really about two very different kinds of time operating at once, and about what happens when a civilization built for one of those timescales runs headlong into the limits of the other. Human time moves fast. A single Garamantian engineer could plan, dig, and complete a section of Sahara tunnel within a working lifetime, could watch water begin flowing into a field he himself had helped irrigate, could raise children who grew up eating dates and grain made possible by his own labor underground. Political time moves fast too, fast enough that a kingdom could be raided by Balbus in 19 BCE, rebuild, thrive for nearly 2 more centuries, get struck again by Septimius Severus in 202 CE, and still recover enough to send its own king leading a foreign traveler deep into inner Africa not so very long afterward. Within a single human lifespan, within a handful of generations, empires rise, fall, adapt, and rise again. That is the timescale most of history, and most historical storytelling is built around. Kings, wars, conquests, treaties, all of it moving at a pace we can intuitively grasp because it roughly matches the pace of our own lives. But underneath all of that very human drama, there was another kind of time running the entire time, silent, patient, and utterly indifferent to human ambition. Geological time. The kind of time it takes for monsoon rains to soak into rock and become an aquifer in the first place, a process unfolding over thousands of years, long before a single Garamantian was ever born. That water had been accumulating since the Green Sahara period, sealed away in stone since long before Herodotus picked up a pen, long before Rome existed as anything more than a scattering of villages beside a river in Italy. And once the Garamantes began drawing that ancient reserve down, at a rate measured in centuries of extraction rather than centuries of replenishment, they were, without fully realizing it, running two very different clocks against each other. Their political and military history moved at human speed, full of triumphs and defeats they could actually perceive and respond to in real time. But the true, ultimate clock governing their civilization's survival, the slow draining of that ancient aquifer, moved at a pace so much slower, so much quieter, that it was almost invisible until it was already far too late to reverse course. That, more than the chariots, more than the pyramid tombs, more than even the staggering scale of the tunnel network itself, might be the single most important thing this story has to teach us. A civilization can win every war it fights. It can outlast two separate invasions by the most powerful empire in its known world. It can build monuments, accumulate wealth, project its influence deep into unmapped territory hundreds of kilometers beyond its own borders. And it can still, ultimately, be undone by something far quieter than any army. A resource, hidden beneath the very ground its people walk on every single day, that simply cannot be replaced once it is gone. If you were the last Garamantes engineer standing at the mouth of a Sahara tunnel that had, for the first time in living memory, produced barely a trickle of water instead of a steady flow, what would you actually do? Would you dig deeper, chasing the retreating water table down into rock that grew harder and more dangerous with every additional meter? Would you look toward the trade caravans, hoping that wealth and captives from distant lands could somehow buy your civilization more time? Would you simply accept that some slow, structural problems cannot be solved by courage, by cleverness, or even by centuries of accumulated engineering skill, and begin, quietly, painfully, to plan for a smaller, humbler way of life than the one your grandparents had known? There is no single, satisfying answer recorded anywhere in the archaeological record. No dramatic final speech from a Garamantes king lamenting the fate of his kingdom. No last desperate engineering plan preserved on a tablet, somewhere waiting to be translated. What we have instead is simply the physical evidence itself. Tunnels that grew longer and deeper over time, as if reaching, again and again, for water that kept retreating further out of reach. Settlements that show signs of political fragmentation in their later phases. A capital that, after centuries of resilience, ultimately faded rather than fell in one final dramatic battle. The Garamantes did not disappear because someone defeated them in a decisive war. They disappeared, gradually, the way a candle burns down rather than the way it is suddenly blown out. And there is something about that particular kind of ending, quiet, incremental, almost administrative in its slowness, that might actually be more unsettling than any dramatic military collapse could ever be. Because dramatic collapses are, in a strange way, almost comforting to think about. They have a clear villain, a clear turning point, a clear moment you can point to and say, here, this is where everything went wrong. The Garamantes story offers no such clean turning point. There was no single battle that doomed them, no single tyrant whose decisions can be neatly blamed for everything that followed. There was simply centuries of success, built on a resource that had a hidden expiration date nobody, at the time, could fully see or measure, followed by centuries of slow, grinding adjustment to a world that could no longer sustain the civilization exactly as it had been. And that is precisely why this story, an obscure desert kingdom most people have never heard of, dug up slowly across nearly a century of patient, unglamorous archaeological fieldwork, and finally understood in full only through modern satellite technology, deserves so much more attention than it currently receives. Not simply because the engineering was remarkable, though it absolutely was. Not simply because the human drama, the Roman wars, the trade networks, the debated question of chariots and captives, is genuinely compelling on its own terms, though it is. But because the Garamantes offer something rarer than an exciting story. They offer a genuine, historically documented example of exactly the kind of challenge more and more human societies are quietly facing today, all over the world right now, in places that have nothing else in common with the ancient Sahara. How do you build and sustain a thriving civilization around a resource that time itself can never fully replace once it is gone? Before we close, it is worth returning briefly to a few threads we opened earlier and never fully tied off, because an honest documentary does not pretend every mystery has been solved just because the ending has arrived. Some of the most interesting parts of the Garamantes story are, quite simply, still open questions, and leaving them open is more honest than manufacturing false certainty. We still do not know, with real confidence, exactly how the earliest Garamantes communities related to the broader Neolithic populations who lived in the Fazan back when the Sahara was still green. Some archaeologists lean towards strong continuity, seeing the classical period Garamantes as direct descendants of the local farmers who first settled along the escarpment of the Wadi al-Ajal around 1000 BCE, gradually building the small hill-fort settlements that would later grow into a unified kingdom. Others point to evidence of significant cultural blending, noting architectural and ceramic influences that may have arrived with migrants from oases further east nearer Egypt, or through contact, and quite possibly intermarriage, with Sahelian peoples to the south, including groups connected to the ancient Tichit culture of what is now southeastern Mauritania. Some researchers have even suggested that the presence of women from these southern Sahelian communities in Garamantes society may itself be connected to the very raiding practices Herodotus described so long ago. The uncomfortable possibility that at least some of the movement of people into Garamantes territory was not voluntary migration at all, but the direct result of the same slave-raiding economy that helped fund the kingdom's wealth. This remains, once again, a genuinely debated area of ongoing research rather than settled fact. But it is a thread worth naming honestly rather than smoothing over. We also still do not know, in anything like full detail, what the Garamantes called themselves, since the name history remembers, Garamantes, comes to us entirely through Greek and Roman writers describing them from the outside, not through any surviving self-description in their own words. We do not know the full content of Garamantes religious belief beyond a handful of temple foundations and funerary inscriptions written in a script scholars can only partially read. We do not know, with total certainty, exactly how political power was distributed within their society, whether Garama functioned as the seat of a single unified monarchy for the kingdom's entire history, or whether, as some researchers have suggested, the wider Garamantes world operated more like a shifting confederation of desert communities, loosely bound together under the dominance of the group centered on the capital, its unity waxing and waning across the centuries, depending on the strength of whichever ruler happened to sit at Garama at any given moment. What we do know, with real confidence, backed by decades of careful excavation and increasingly precise satellite and geological survey work, is enough to make absolutely clear that this was never the primitive, wandering desert tribe ancient Roman writers so casually dismissed them as. The Garamantes introduced the horse, the camel, and wheeled transport into Saharan life in a serious, systematic way. They developed genuine urban centers, with population estimates for the capital region alone reaching into the thousands, supported by outlying farming communities that pushed the wider kingdom's total population estimates dramatically higher. They built temples showing clear cultural exchange with Egyptian and Greco-Roman religious traditions. They minted no coins of their own, so far as archaeology has revealed, yet still managed to run a trade economy sophisticated enough to move gold, salt, glassware, and uncomfortably, human captives across some of the most hostile terrain on the planet, connecting the deep African interior with the Mediterranean world for the better part of 1,000 years. And they did all of this while quietly running, underneath every single one of those achievements, the largest hand-dug irrigation project the ancient world had ever produced south of Persia. A system so vast that it would take modern satellite imagery, hundreds of kilometers up in orbit, to finally reveal its true scale to a world that had almost entirely forgotten it existed. We began this story standing on a ridge above buried tunnels you could not see, carrying water you could not hear, built by people whose names we will, in almost every individual case, never actually know. We end it somewhere very different, standing instead at the edge of a much larger, much more uncomfortable question, one that reaches far beyond the borders of ancient Libya, far beyond the specific fate of one desert kingdom, and settles instead on all of us, watching this story from wherever we happen to be sitting right now, in cities and towns that, in more cases than most of us probably realize, are themselves quietly drawing down ancient, non-renewing water reserves buried somewhere beneath our own feet. Think back for a moment to where we started, that image of standing on a bare ridge of rock in the middle of the Sahara, with nothing visible in any direction, and a hidden river of ancient water running silently beneath your feet. Now think about everything that image was actually hiding from you at the time. Not just water, but 750 kilometers of tunnels dug by hand. Not just tunnels, but cities, temples, pyramid tombs, and a population in the tens of thousands. Not just a population, but a genuine kingdom, one confident enough to fight Rome, lose, rebuild, fight Rome again, and still find the resources afterward to send its own king 4 months deep into inner Africa on a mission of conquest and diplomacy. And underneath all of that, quietly, invisibly, the whole time, a resource with a hidden expiration date that nobody living in that era could see clearly enough to plan around. If you were watching this unfold in real time, generation after generation, would you have noticed the warning signs before it was too late? Would you have been the engineer arguing for deeper, more ambitious tunnels, certain that Garamantes ingenuity could always outpace the problem? Or would you have been the quieter voice, easy to ignore in a kingdom still flush with trade wealth and recent military resilience, suggesting that maybe, just maybe, a civilization built entirely around a resource that could never be replaced needed to start planning for a future where that resource eventually ran thin? There is no way to answer that question with certainty, not for the Garamantes, and honestly, not for any of us either. That may be the most unsettling gift this obscure, half-forgotten desert kingdom has to offer anyone willing to actually sit with their story instead of just skimming past it. Not a lesson about ancient history, safely sealed away behind 2,000 years of distance. A mirror quietly angled just close enough to catch our own reflection in it, whether we were quite ready to look or not. So here is the question worth sitting with, long after this particular story has ended. If a civilization as resourceful, as resilient, and as genuinely brilliant as the Garamantes could build an empire that lasted roughly 1,000 years, only to be undone, in the end, not by an enemy army, but by a clock they could not see ticking beneath their own cities, what makes us so certain that the civilizations we are building right now, on top of our own hidden, finite resources, are reading that same clock any more clearly than they did?